Hi, good morning, everyone. All right, so I'm going to take you back to 2012 when a UX researcher from this very room visited India. And the question she brought with her was, why are so many Indian people using dual SIM phones? And so we took a device that she wanted to test. We recruited a bunch of users who were dual SIM phone users, and we watched them unbox it. We spoke to them over weeks, and then we finally brought them back together to understand what their experience was like. This is the reason I'm here today, because this UX researcher had me invited here to speak, so thank you very much, Jenny. But also, since then, and even prior to that, I've always been involved in representing contextual realities for product, service, and systems innovation. My name is Namrata, and over the last decade, I've worked as a consultant with the Vihara Innovation Network in India. I've been an associate with the government of Haryana, which is a small state in my country. And today, I work with the creepy yet cool Uber as a global researcher. But at my core, I'm a sociologist and a designer, and so I think I know a thing or two about user experience that I'd like to share with you today. But what I want to focus on today is the very unique opportunity that we as user experience practitioners have in a context like India. One, as it relates to the kind of problems that we have the opportunity to solve, and two, as it relates to how we can actually help solve them. This is the city of Gurgaon. It's where I'm from. Yesterday, I was speaking to David, and he asked me, is the context of UX in India really that different? And I want to say yes, because development in India is very imbalanced. Gurgaon is a millennium city. It has no sewage system to talk about. It doesn't have a public transport network. And all of the buildings in the back are powered by diesel generators, even though you can see all these electric lines in the photograph. For years now, Indians have sort of watched with despair as the private sector has sort of taken off and learned to conquer technology, sort of got the skills of user experience design, and are building products that are global in nature, essentially. And on the other hand, we have the public sector that has tended to lag behind and hasn't really changed very much. I just want to correct a little thing that Emma said, which is there are more Indians that have access to toilets than mobile phones, but it's actually the other way around. This is a figure from the 2011 census, so it's definitely dated, and perhaps the gap has shrunk. But there are more people in India today, I think the figure is around 88% today, that have mobile phones than they have access to toilets. And that's what's really, really interesting is, as a UX practitioner, to sort of work with this dichotomy of, on the one hand, we have some really severe problems to solve. There's anemia, there's hunger, there's corruption, there's healthcare, there's malnutrition. And on the other, we have the opportunity to actually define what global product experiences are like, because you can no longer ignore an Indian consumer. And so I define this opportunity in two ways. One is that there's an opening up of the government, and we need to insert ourselves into that opening up. And the second is the private pursuit of public innovation. And that's essentially what I'd like to talk about today. One, how do we actually help the public sector catch up? How do we close that gap? And two, how do we encourage the private sector to solve real challenges that need to be solved? I'm going to take you to the state of Bihar in eastern India. Bihar has a population density of about 1,000 people per square kilometer. To give you a comparison, Sweden has 22 people per square kilometer. So you can see what the difference is like. In Bihar, for every 1,000 infants that are born, 38 will die. And for every 100,000 mothers who give birth, 98 will not live. And you wouldn't imagine that this is a problem that someone would say, hey, user experience people, come, help us solve this. But that's exactly what happened to us way back in 2009. And we were invited to help figure out where the problem really lied. Why were so many children and mothers dying? And so the central question that we tried to ask is, where are the missing children? We know the solution to this, right? The solution is vaccines. But why aren't they reaching the people it's meant to be reaching? And why isn't it actually solving the problem that it was designed and invented to solve? And so it took us about 9 months. We had about 10 researchers out in the field trying to understand where these children were and why they weren't being immunized and why we were losing them. We spoke to everybody possible. We visited families, and we spoke to frontline health workers who were responsible for service delivery. And then we sort of came back and put all of that together in a process that most of y'all are very familiar with. We mapped out all the stakeholders, understood their motivations, where were the failures in the system, what were the design principles that we needed to apply in order to actually solve them. And then we created this range of solutions. We called them 34 Ways to Save Lives in Rural India. We were very happy with ourselves. But then we were like, wait, but whose responsibility is it to actually make these solutions and put them on ground? So I'm going to provoke you a little bit, because this is a sentence that provokes me every time I hear it. Ideas are cheap. When I hear this, it sort of hits me in the gut. And I was like, oh, so much of what I do is idea generation. And then it's coupled with this. Implementation is everything. And that's when I realized that we, as UX practitioners, really need to insert ourselves into the process of implementation if we want to make the change that we want to see happen. How have I done this? Or how have I been able to know what needs to happen? So I'm going to take you through 3 examples of models that I've seen work somewhat, and hope that we can replicate more and more of that to happen. The first principle is to collaborate. So in the example of helping to save more lives in rural India, we created a lab. It was an innovation lab. We had at our center us as UX practitioners and designers and researchers. We collaborated with implementation partners who actually brought on the knowledge and the expertise of maternal and child healthcare. We had the government on one hand, and we obviously had someone who was funding this. And we said, you know what, let's all get together and work on this together, because it's not a solution that only one person is going to be able to solve. The second thing that we did is we narrowed it down from 34 to 4. We said, let's focus on what's most crucial, or let's focus on what some would call low-hanging fruit, so that when we're able to sort of achieve some success, we can move on to the next stage. And then we picked 8 districts within the state that we thought really needed this, and in some ways would be great contexts to actually test them out in. And over the course of 2 years, we were able to do this. We created better mobilization techniques so that mothers and children were actually coming to get immunized. We created better identification tokens so that we could track the healthcare of the children that we were wanting to serve. We created medical devices or supporting medical devices so that frontline health workers, when they went to remote villages in Bihar, were able to carry everything that they needed with them. And we also redesigned how labor in a primary health center with no electricity can actually be tracked and managed. The second thing that I think is really important is to persist. And I'm going to take you through another example of an institutional structure that I've been a part of. This is a collaboration between another state government of India and a university, an academic setting. And what we do is we've built a sort of cohort of UX practitioners or people who are trained in doing that, and we've distributed them across each and every district of the state. They've become the eyes and ears of the public service delivery mechanism in the state. They're reporting back almost every single day. What are the challenges that our users are facing when they go to get their driver's license, when they go to access land records, and so many other things. We've sort of inserted ourselves into the process of implementation. Not only are we taking the feedback back to the government, but we're also making sure that the solutions that we build in collaboration with the departments concerned are actually being implemented on ground. It seems like really annoying work, and it is, But it's essentially what's needed in order to see any kind of change happen. The third is scale. And this is kind of where my experience with Uber kicks in. For those of you who might not know already, Uber exists in over 600 cities, in 65 countries around the world, in 6 continents. In 2017 alone, there were 4 billion rides that we completed. And we have about 3 million active drivers globally, probably a tenth of that in India. So this is kind of everything you need to know. But what happens with that kind of scale is the complexity of what you're creating increases, because the context that you're serving suddenly becomes so different from one another. So this is, for example, a pickup location in India. And we kind of have to design for a car actually being able to come here to pick somebody up who's called them. And what's interesting about this challenge is that in the next year, more than 80% of the company's trips are going to come from places like India and other analogous contexts, whether it's Egypt or Brazil or Mexico. So what have we done? We have a team of global researchers that I'm a part of, and we're embedded across the world, because what we think is really important is for us to sort of bring back the contextual knowledge of what it's actually like to be in contexts like ours while you're trying to create a sort of global, universal experience. What is priority in Latin America? Safety. What is priority in India? Low-cost handsets and bad connectivity. What is priority in Europe? Maybe loyalty. It changes from every region, and we really want to represent that when we think about scale or we think about sort of a global product. So we have teams in 4 regions. We're embedded within product teams directly, but then we're also looking at regional variations and what might be needed. And then we're also sort of helping build a product that can scale. So some of you might have seen that Uber recently redesigned its driver app. And the way in which we did this is we spent a year with in-car testing, actually trying to understand what the driver's problems were and put them at the center. And then we sort of created a product that we were willing to test out. And we had 7 different beta cities that we worked in. A few things that we were thinking about was, how do we move the privilege away from US drivers to drivers across the world? Because Uber has a very different meaning to people all over the world. And once we did that, we sort of used very quick and dirty methodologies. We brought people together over WhatsApp groups to get their feedback on what they thought. We rode along with drivers. We had group lunches. And together, we were able to sort of launch this all across the globe just last month. So those are some institutional structures that I've been a part of that I think help in ensuring that UX as a practice is actually embedded within institutions that we want to be able to change, or products that we want to be able to bring to people that need them. But here are a few questions or principles that cut across all of them. For one, I think we need to constantly ask ourselves, are we reinventing the wheel? So when we worked with the lab in Bihar, we had a few colleagues in Indonesia who were looking closely at our work, and they were like, you know what? This feels like the kind of problems we have there. Why don't you come and test your stuff out here? And so we did exactly that. We had about 7 innovation specialists. We spent maybe 2 months on field. And we prototyped in context. We said, here are some concepts from India. Let's see if they work in Indonesia. Let's see if you have a case for them. And here's what we found. In some instances, solutions that you're bringing to a culture or a new context don't have a place for them, because that isn't a problem that needs to be solved. And so you say, OK, I'm going to stop trying to do this. In other cases, you've brought a solution, but there's already a bigger, better solution that exists in the context. OK, let's not move forward here. In some cases, you bring it, and you find a match, and you're like, OK, this seems to work, but we need to change it slightly for it to actually make a difference. And in the third case, or in the fourth case, you'd probably come across something new that you never even thought of. You're like, OK, we need to really solve for this. So it kind of really helps when you're exchanging information and when you're constantly sharing, because you come to realize truths about your own context as well as truths about other contexts. And you're able to sort of make change happen faster. The second is to facilitate the real ethnographers. When working with the government, for example, we realized that the ones who are frontline, center, speaking to citizens every day, actually know everything they need to know. They just haven't been facilitated through a process that we have the luxury of going through to be able to come out on the other side with solutions that we think would really work and make a difference. And it becomes it becomes incumbent on us to be able to share or take them through that process of facilitation so that they can use all of the knowledge they have to get out on the other side. And I think that is truly the role of what we can have in contexts like India. And so with the Bihar Innovation Lab, what we tried doing is we built a training program for administrators and frontline health workers so that they could be part of the process and they could pick up the skills and they would no longer need us. The other is to work out loud. And this is a practice that I think is just really useful as a reflection. If you're working out loud, you're constantly thinking about what you're doing, and you're also sharing with somebody else, because someone's going to hear you, and someone's going to say, hey, you know what? I'm experiencing the exact same thing. Or you know what? I already have a solution for that. Why don't you take it? And so this is what we've done with the government of Haryana. We're saying, you know what? You need to keep talking about the work you're doing, because somebody out there has probably experienced this. And it could just be your experience of working within the government, but it could actually be about the solution that you're trying to build. At Uber, for example, we use G+ as a way of making sure that as soon as I'm done with a user interview, 600 people in my organization know exactly what happened. And they're able to action on that information really, really quickly, instead of waiting for us to sort of prepare a report that they can then consume and take decisions on. So always be talking about what you're doing. The other thing I've noticed is that we sort of have to move really quickly. No one's going to wait around, and often the processes and the methodologies that we use consume a lot of time, and we don't have that luxury. And so, for example, one of the things that we're doing at Uber right now is we've gone into a sort of weekly cadence or a bi-weekly cadence where we're continuously generating new insights on what works and what doesn't work. And we're getting requests from all parts of the organization that says, hey, can you tell me if this specific thing is going to work in India or no? And we're able to very quickly give them something, because it's better to have that than to not have that at all. And it's better to do it sooner rather than later. So that's about all I had to share with you today. I think the opportunity that we have in India is to insert ourselves into the process of implementation for social change, whether that's within the government or whether that's in the private sector. And I also think it's kind of important to have the experience of both and see how they can begin to collaborate. We need to collaborate, persist, and think of scale. We need to ensure that we're not reinventing the wheel, that we're facilitating the people who have the real knowledge and power to actually make change happen, that we're continuously working out loud, and that we're working fast so that we're able to see the returns quickly. Thank you.
Come out from behind the podium.
OK.
You've done user research in lots of different cultures,
Yeah.
lots of different countries. Let's say that I had, Yuan, if I suddenly got the task to go somewhere exotic and unfamiliar to me, what advice would you give me when doing user research in an unfamiliar culture?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is make sure that you've read as much as you can or spoken to as many people who have exposure to that context or culture. But I also think it's really important to just be yourself. And just remember that in any kind of user research, you're just a person talking to another person or trying to get to know them. And so I think you need to be as honest and humble about who you are and where you're from. Yeah. Ask as many questions. Yeah, I think that's essentially what the attitude should be.
Sounds good. Sounds like advice for the party as well, basically. Okay. I know that you're also an artist, and I'm curious, is there anything about your artistic process that influences your user research and vice versa? Any overlap?
I don't think there's an overlap, but I think there's an energy. So I've found that conceptually it helps sometimes to have an art practice, because then you're able to sort of model interactions maybe in a certain way. Or you're able to borrow from a practice that doesn't have any implications as such, or it's all in your head. But I think the other place where my art practice comes in is when there is no process, there is no structure, and you just sort of have to respond to a situation. And I think that's where it becomes really useful. Is how do you work without that? Because we so often lean on like rules and methods and technique, and I think sometimes you just have to let that go, and I think that's where having an art practice really helps.
Cool. You've mentioned that you work at Uber, and I think a lot of us, we know that Uber gets a lot of bad press. I think we're curious to know how you made the decision to work there and how that all came about.
If you knew the government of Haryana, you'd probably be like, well, they have a pretty bad reputation as well. So sometimes I'm like, you know what, maybe that's my purpose. I just go from one beast to another. But
that's why you're here. It's from business to buttons. Okay.
But I think having said that, I think solutions like what Uber brings to the table has a lot of implications to how mobility will play itself out in India, how employment will work in the future, and things that maybe we take for granted sometimes. Women's safety is a huge concern in a country like India, and personally speaking, irrespective of my employment with them, it makes a huge difference to your ability to just move around. And and so I think from that point of view, it makes a lot of sense. And I also think that it's important for all of us to be able to put ourselves in different situations, so we're building the vocabulary and are able to bridge the gaps then between two sides of a coin that maybe don't always speak to one another. So,
I have a very particular question. You showed this crowded marketplace in India, and you said that that's a hard place for someone to come and pick up a customer. What solution did you come up with?
In that particular case?
For that problem.
Oh, we're still working on it, but you'll see it.
So maybe if you have any ideas.
You need to come to India.
I'd love to.
Yeah, you should do that.
So there's a gift for you.
Thank you.
And it's been great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
Please give a hand for Namrata, Mehta. Thank you.
Thank you.